Continuing with Gregory Brandt's wonderful memoir, Homeless College Student. This is Chapter 5, Coke Addiction, Pill Poppers, and Police Officers. Let's find it here. Okay. Coke Addiction, Pill Poppers, and Police Officers. Chapter 5. The first thing I did after Lisa gave me the apartment was invite Michael to come live with me. It was a decent place in a bad neighborhood, and we had our 21st and 22nd birthdays there. Lisa let me keep Javier's clothes and furniture, and we were still good friends. Janet and Jonathan didn't ever visit my apartment. Benny only came over a handful of times. Once someone has a particular image of you in their head, no matter how inaccurate, they don't like to see things which don't match up to the story of you which they made up in their head. This was the part of my life working as a telemarketer which was less memorable than other parts. Most days blend together to create a monochrome montage of random tidbits of images and memories with no semblance of order. This is how most people live their entire lives. After 6 months, I realized I needed a way out of telemarketing. The 9 to 5 thing wasn't working. I'd sell a lot of newspaper subs, and management loved that, but my heart wasn't in it, spending most of my workday daydreaming about being a homeless vagabond, a full-time college student, or just about anything other than a telemarketer. I had a long-term goal of higher education, but I was in a telemarketing world that was banal and plagued. I was their top salesman, but I loathed my position. For 8 hours a day, I talked to people on the phone while put in a trance by the ancient computer screen and his arbitrary phone numbers with unfamiliar area codes. One way I kept myself distracted was by making sure I always had pen and paper on me. If I wasn't daydreaming, I'd be sketching doodles, poetry, or sappy song lyrics, anything to remind me of life beyond jail. I was anxious being 22 and hadn't ever set foot in a college classroom. The more I worked at my telemarketing job, the more my academic goals faded. Some people have been stuck selling papers there for years. There was a few shabbily dressed seniors who'd been working the phones for decades. Management belittled them every chance they got, usually making fun of their clothes or noticeable odor of cat piss. Most employees were from the poor parts of town. The office had a central location near a lot of bus routes. If you wanted a job, you could get it the same day. They hired felons, pregnant teens, and elderly spinsters just happy to get away from the cats for a few hours. A few misguided college students occasionally wandered in, answering a 2-line ad in the classified section of the paper, but they never lasted. It was only a matter of time before I found a way to spit on the system. We got a 30-minute lunch break, so after my second day, I started going home to smoke an enormous amount of weed in a brief period of time. Benny and I used to call it power smoking. It mellowed me out just enough to sell enough papers not to despise the rest of my day. Soon I started to invite a bunch of my weed-smoking coworkers back to my place for lunch. Within a month, half the office was smogging out my living room. Someone always asked if I knew where to get weed, so it didn't take long before I became the official office weed dealer. I was a generous dealer with plenty of business. Most of my customers were people I worked with, but I sold a few bags to my old neighborhood friends too. Dealing small amounts of weed was one of the most productive things I did in poverty. I didn't have a car, so I'd usually pay someone to drive me across town to pick up about a pound per week. Michael wasn't busy at the time, so he'd watch the stash and make any necessary transactions when I was gone. I kept my business tidy, separating every big bag I bought into dimes, quarters, and ounces. After I had everything weighed and bagged, I put them in a mini fridge to keep them fresh. Whenever someone came over, I'd pop open the fridge and let them choose whichever bag they wanted. I even made little price tags with colored construction paper. Things were going good until a coke dealer moved in next door. Her name was Inez, and she was all about business. She was about my age, but looked a lot older. A mother with 3 with one on her way, her tots were constantly circling her ankles, yelling out demands. Each of them had a different father, but shared the same bleak future. The day she moved in, I told her I sold weed, and she told me she dealt coke. A bond was formed, and it wasn't long before we were trading customers. Her clients didn't know where to get good bud, and my friends didn't know where to score decent blow. I didn't think much of the consequences. I was just implementing good business practices. One day, a weed customer came over without any cash. He had a small bag of coke and wanted to trade. It was Sunday morning, I was off work, and I had nothing to do and no one coming over, so I hesitantly took the powder and gave him a dime bag, figuring I'd trade it later. I held the bag in the light and noticed it was decorated with purple peace symbols. This gave the deadly substance an aura of innocence. I'd seen the harm coke can do and promised myself never to get involved, but I'd done it a few times and never once felt the least bit addicted. I decided to watch Pulp Fiction to give me time to think it over, but by the time Christopher Walken pulls the watch out, I'd already snorted half the bag and was debating on getting more. When the movie ended, I put on the college radio station to distract myself, but in doing so, I discovered a weekly Beatles program that I hadn't ever heard before. The Beatles are my favorite band, so I saw this as a sign to get more coke. I couldn't have picked better circumstances. I had cash, I was bored with being a telemarketer, and I lived next to a coke dealer. When Monday morning came, I surprisingly didn't feel that bad. It wasn't anything worse than a hangover. At work, I had more energy and a secret that nobody knew. It gave me something to look forward to on my day off. I figured that as long as I kept my habit at weekly intervals, I wouldn't get hooked. I didn't crave the stuff during the week, but I counted the days before I could snort cocaine by myself with candles, mirrors, and the Beatles radio show. Every Sunday would be a religious service in my living room, but the only one in attendance was me. Cocaine makes a user bold, emotional, and creative. When I wasn't shoving powder in my nose, but high on cocaine, I'd write psychedelic poetry or detailed letters to celebrities, politicians, and friends I hadn't spoken to in years. One weekend, I bought 2 VCRs and made an epic montage of classic film clips, old-school cartoons, and Attenborough wildlife videos. Another time, I made a one-person play on my answering machine to entertain callers. My friends couldn't believe how talented I was. Cocaine may have not been the answer to my problems, but it got me off my ass and motivated me to actually start doing things. It wouldn't last, so I started asking around the office to see if anyone knew about financial aid for college, but most people there that worked there hadn't ever been close to a college before. That's why I was happily surprised when a smiley college kid who just moved to Texas with his family from South Dakota started working the phone next to mine. His name was John Hershey, and he was going to community college for a few years before I met him at the telemarketing office. John and his gang of stoner friends started off as regular pot customers, but after a few weeks, my apartment became their official hangout spot. They used it to do drugs, watch TV, and listen to music. I didn't tell Hershey and his friends about my coke habit. I kept it a secret and preferred to do it alone. I did other drugs with them like mushrooms and MDMA. They still lived with their parents, so even though they said I was the coolest person they ever met, I knew they were probably just using me because I had my own place and sold weed. My coke addiction wasn't expensive at first. It started out at just $20 every few days for the first couple of weeks. But after a month it doubled. I made good money selling weed and I was still working full-time, so I let having a couple bucks in the bank be my excuse to do more coke. My productivity at work improved. I was more aggressive selling papers, and coworkers began listening to me more. It's like cocaine activated the dominant lion part of my brain that had been sleeping. I was more productive outside of work too. I expanded my marijuana business and bought twice as much pot every week. I also put together a weekly poker game, which I dominated every time. I even convinced Michael to take over my post helping Lisa throw the newspaper. During a weed run one day, I spotted a used van for $900. Michael and I went over there and knocked on the door. The guy selling the van was drunk and drove us around for an hour listening to a baseball game before finally giving us the keys. I bought it, but I hardly ever drove it. I still walked to and from work every day. Michael would drive it here and there, but it was mainly used for marijuana pickups. Every weekend, I'd pay someone $50 to drive it across town and pick up a pound of weed. Things were going well on the surface, but coke was eating my soul. I kept up with my telemarketing job until they changed my shift from second to first. This meant that instead of coming in at noon every day, now I had to be there at 8 a.m. I'd gotten used to doing coke till the sun came up, sleeping a few hours, then jumping up and getting to work. One night I was doing lines until 6 a.m. There wasn't time to sleep, so I did a little more and stepped out the front door to head to work. By the time I got there, I felt like the Walking Dead and the world was like a rancid sack of pus. The last thing I felt like doing was selling newspaper subscriptions, and I had to run to the bathroom twice for nosebleeds. During lunch, I still went back to my apartment, but instead of smoking weed, I got out a metal spoon, some baking soda, a roll of foil, and an empty paper towel roll. After mixing the coke and baking soda on the spoon, I spit a couple drops of saliva on the sheet of foil. Then I took the powder mixture and made a paste-like batter, covering one side of the sheet of foil. When I had the batter evenly distributed across the shiny side of the foil, I balanced it on top of my 27-inch TV, which was mute but playing a black and white movie. The sheet of foil was balanced on top of the television by two of the unusual bunny rabbit knickknacks I was collecting at the time. There was a slight breeze coming in through the window, and the sheet of foil was gently blowing in the wind. After I had the foil completely balanced, I shoved the empty toilet paper roll in my mouth, holding it there with my teeth. Then, with one hand, I held one side of the foil, and with the other hand, a flame under the bottom side of the foil. As the chemical-infested smoke slowly slithered up one side of the toilet paper roll, through the roll into my mouth and down into my lungs, I went into a trance and stared at the black and white TV, high on crack. A few days later, I was in a bathtub trying not to pass out after a freebasing binge. My irregular heartbeat gets a little psycho during hardcore coke use. The condition has been giving me dizzy spells since I was a kid, usually happening when I stand up too quickly or immediately after an intense basketball game. It's a case of the oxygen not having time to get to my brain. However, I never had a dizzy spell naked in a bathtub full of lavender-scented bubbles. I was in a tub high in crack with my life slipping away. Things went fuzzy, water went up my nose, and I could feel myself splashing around the tub looking like Helen Keller asking for water. My dizzy spells are usually peaceful, like the feeling you get before you fall asleep. Your imagination fills your minds with millions of uncorrelated thoughts while your brain moves at light speed, like a Rolodex made up of everything you recently saw, thought, or overheard. It's like someone telling you about their monumental day, but they're speaking gibberish in a non-linear narrative. I had to get oxygen flowing to my brain before any brain damage set in, so I used what I had left to pull my naked body out of the casket onto the moldy bathroom floor. I didn't go to work the next day. Other than 9/11, it was the first day I missed in 2 years. The manager called and tried to make me feel guilty. That wasn't happening. I quit right there over the phone. He called back 20 times before getting the message. I told him that a life away from cocaine was more important to me than selling shitty newspaper subscriptions. For the next 6 hours, I stared out the window, compared to usually staring at the computer screen at work. I didn't feel like looking for a new job. I didn't want to live in that apartment anymore. Most importantly, I refused to be a coke addict. I decided to ditch my apartment, job, and neighborhood. I had lived there for 2 years. It took about an hour to completely empty the place. I didn't pack much. Instead, I created a big mound of crap in the front yard. Whatever furniture I couldn't throw out my second-story window, I dragged downstairs and tossed into the pile. I was originally going to douse everything with gasoline and create a liberating inferno before I realized that would have only caused too much attention. I got in my van, put on a worn-down Tom Petty cassette tape, and headed towards freedom, leaving my addiction where I found it. I didn't have access to a rehab facility, but I knew the first step to sobriety is to avoid the influence. So I got on the freeway and drove slow in the right lane. An hour later, I found myself in the neighborhood I grew up in and pulled into the Target's Superstore's parking lot. After a couple hours, I finally went inside Target and bought 4 plastic crates. I was going to take an inventory and organize my van. One crate I designated for camping equipment, another was for tools and auto parts. A third crate was for entertainment. It had board games, a deck of cards, a basketball, football, and a mini razor scooter. The fourth crate was most important. It had all my photographs, journals, and dog-eared paperbacks I've been collecting over the years. My van was clean and organized, but I still had no idea where to go. I had recently been watching hours of David Attenborough nature videos, and I figured being in the wild would be the best setting to beat this particular addiction. However, the only nature I could think of was at Canyon Lake, a man-made shithole off I-35 halfway between San Antonio and Austin. When I got to the lake, I drove about 2 miles per hour down a dirt road until I couldn't go anymore. I hadn't slept outside in a couple years, and it took a while to get used to. I went from going to bed to the sounds of police sirens and lowriders' car bass to owl hoots and coyote howls. The most important thing was to quit cocaine. It was going to be painful, but if anyone could beat a crack addiction cold turkey, it was me. During the middle of the night, I felt sick to my stomach and threw up my filthiness like an inmate on his deathbed. The morning couldn't get there fast enough. I needed a warm bed and a little encouragement, but I couldn't think of anywhere that'd take me. When the sun came up, I instinctively started driving back to San Antonio, determined not to go back to the neighborhood I found my crack addiction, but figuring that if I hung around the north side long enough, I'd find someone to help. I got off I-35 and drove to Brook Hollow Library. It was my childhood hangout. It was about 2.5 hour walk from our house, about 6 miles, but we didn't have much else to do and made the trip hundreds of times. I remember they had the coldest, best tasting tap water we ever had. At home we had to drink from the bathroom sink. The library is where we'd escape. It didn't matter if we were hiding from bullies, cops, or our father. We could always go to the library. Old habits are hard to break, and I felt a lot safer sitting in my van at the library than I did eaten alive by bugs at the lake. I fit in the library with my oversized backpack and schoolboy hair. By the end of the day, I spotted a librarian giving me notice while I read the paper. She looked like a recent college grad, pumped up about being a librarian. She was modern and spunky, with short spiked hair, no makeup, and trendy clothes. Probably a lesbian. I'd been there all day, and after I saw her looking at me, I got worried she was going to ask me to leave. So I went up to her and asked her about the internet. I want to see if I could find money for college, I said. Have you ever been to college, she asked. No. Did you graduate from high school? I got my GED, I told her. She showed me how to get online and spent the next 2 hours helping me fill out the proper forms for getting financial aid. I don't do this for everyone, she said, but I can tell you're smart. I left the library and felt more human. I wasn't thinking about cocaine. I was thinking about getting my life together and someday going to college. The librarian gave me more encouragement in 2 hours than I had had in the previous 6 years. I had that feeling you get when you call your mom from a payphone on a long road trip, like someone cares. I got back on I-35 in a better mood and drove to the first Exxon Tiger Mart I saw. Tiger Marts have clean restrooms with locking doors. They're perfect when you're homeless and need to brush your teeth, wash your face, or clean your feet. After taking a bird bath, I parked behind the gas station's dumpster and went to sleep early. The next morning, I woke up to a late model Ford Econoline van pulling in front of the trash bin where I made camp. Its occupants jumped out in an exuberant mood. They were wearing University of Texas garb on their way to some sort of UT sporting event. I crouched down in the back of my van in shame while they emptied their trash. I saw the regalia as a sign that I needed to get to Austin. It'd be safer and I'd have much more fun beating a coke addiction in a city that I actually enjoyed living in. I didn't have to live in San Antonio just because that's where I'm from. That lesson took a while to learn. I hit the interstate and in an hour I was in Travis County. Not thinking about my past, I stopped grasping the city I was from like I needed it for air. I thought about what the librarian said. I stayed positive and concentrated on how I could make my future better with college. When I got to Austin, I parked my van a couple blocks from campus and spent the day walking around UT. Later that evening, I went in Dolby Mall and sat outside their movie theater. Looking outside the second-story window at the attractive kids below, I admired their squeaky clean looks and fashionable clothes. I was the same age as them, but I felt a lot younger, like a younger outsider with nothing but an unusual story and background. I sat at the window for hours until there wasn't anyone on the street outside, only a few drag rats scurrying around for a vacant hole to crawl inside. All the well-dressed college students I was watching earlier had gone back to the dorms, smoky co-ops, and luxury apartments. It was getting late, and I was worried about finding a place to park my van. I had just enough gas to get to a rest stop south of town and back to Austin in the morning for day labor. I figured it was my best bet, and I hit I-35. When I got past downtown, I pulled over to a Chevron gas station to put air in my tires. I was standing outside my van by the air machine when a cop pulled up behind me and flicked his lights. I gave him a friendly wave like everything was okay, but he didn't get out of his car. He made me nervous, so I lifted the hood and pretended like I was messing with the hoses. It wasn't smart, and I accidentally took off a belt that was attached to 6 or 7 different mechanical devices. I figured I'd put it back together after the cop left, but when he did, I couldn't get it back on to save my life. A truck with Arkansas plates pulled over, and a sickly 4-foot little man in a leather jacket got out. He looked like a ghoul from a Lemony Snicket novel. He gave me a phony smile, showing me his baked bean teeth. Then a lengthy prostitute jumped out of the truck in high heels and a neon pink miniskirt. She looked like she'd just come from a 1980s themed horror convention in Times Square. She smacked her gum and asked what was going on, to which he replied, "Get back in there!" He took a look at my engine and immediately diagnosed the problem. "Your full-range flux capacitor belt is out." "Full-range flux capacitor belt?" I asked. It sounded familiar. "Flux capacitor belt," I asked. "Yeah, it connects the electricity to the gas," he said. "Oh, okay. How much to fix it?" "Well, I can go get it apart for a mile away," he said. "Costs about $20. He had a southern accent which reminded me of JD's, so I took a chance and gave him my last $20. I told him it was my last 20 and even showed him the inside of my wallet. He acted insulted, but I wanted to make sure he understood the situation. I wanted him to know that if he ripped me off, he'd be taking a man's last $20. I figured that nobody could sleep after doing something like that. I patiently waited for a few hours before the gas station clerk came outside and asked me what was wrong. "Oh, I'm okay," I told him. "The flux capacitor went out, but someone's on their way to give me a new one." He looked at me confused before busted out laughing. I ain't never heard of a flux capacitor, but a flux capacitor is from a movie, he said with a chuckle. I hope you get back to 1985, Marty McFly. What are you talking about? The flux capacitor is a fictional time-traveling device from Back to the Future, he said. You know the 1980s movie? Whoever went to get you one ain't coming back, and if he does, he'll probably have that wild-eyed scientist with him. Ha ha ha, the clerk said. I was never going to see my money again, but I pretty much knew that. I'm an optimist, and I was trying to buy an easy way out when God obviously wanted me to fix the van myself. After a few hours of tinkering, I somehow figured out that the belt that I screwed up was supposed to be attached to the alternator, the power steering block, and a few other unknown complicated-looking devices. I once saw on a show on TV where the character used a pair of pantyhose in place of an automotive belt, so I walked to the closest H-E-B and bought some cheap pantyhose with the change in my ashtray. When I got back to my van, I tried to fit the pantyhose where the belt would have been. I'd start off vertical at the top of the hood and wrap the hose around all the various attachments before crawling around to the hood and hooking it up to everything else. It was at a few hours. I was at it a few hours, covered in dirt and oil, when I snagged my hand on a piece of loose metal and blood started squirting everywhere as I screamed like a banshee. I closed my eyes and laid under my van, covered in a mix of blood, oil, and sweat. The manager of the gas station eventually came right out before he was about to start his morning shift. Any luck? He asked me. No, not yet. I've heard you've been here all night. I'm trying to fix my van, I said assertively. 20 minutes before I call the cops, he said, more assertively. I had to get out of there before the cops towed my van and I went to jail. I didn't have any money to get my van out of tow or me out of jail, and me nor the van were even registered. I didn't have insurance, a place of residence, or even a valid driver's license. What I did have was a tad bit of pot and a bunch of unpaid traffic warrants. I was so tired it was like tripping acid, but I kept working on the van until the sun peeked out on the horizon. A few minutes later, I started to play out what I was going to say to the cops when they got there, and I started laughing. I hardly ever laugh, so when I do, it's kind of a monumental event. My task suddenly seemed much easier, and I somehow managed to rig the pantyhose around the alternator and fan. I could get the van to start, but I couldn't get it over 20 miles per hour, so I drove on the access road with my emergencies on. I only made it a few miles before it overheated, and I pulled over and walked to the side of the highway, to the next side of the highway, H-E-B. I found a quarter on the ground and used it in their generic soda machine. It accidentally gave me 2 sodas for the price of one, and I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. I drank both slowly, savoring their sparkly goodness. While we have a break here, if you haven't already, hit the like and subscribe button. And write in your comments what you think of this. Homeless college student. Okay. Alright. After the van cooled, I got back on the road, but only had enough gas to make it about 10 miles. I figured I'd be forced to panhandle when it ran out, and I avoid panhandling like diet soda. A few occasions I've tried it, but I always feel like a jerk and wish I wouldn't have bothered. I made it to the H-E-B in Kyle, but I didn't see many people there like I felt like asking for money from, so I hung out in the employee smoking section for the rest of the day. After it got dark, I struck up a conversation with a stoner-looking cashier. We shot the shit for 20 minutes. I told him my story, and he gave me $5 and half a pack of Marlboro Lights. On the next leg, I made it through San Marcos and into New Braunfels. The van started smoking like crazy, so I pulled over, popped open the hood, and found my Jimmy rig pantyhose burnt crisp. I had no money, and unless I could get some pantyhose or a new belt, my van wasn't going to leave the side of the highway. I didn't have any better ideas, so I locked the van and started walking 30 miles to San Antonio, like an idiot. After the 3rd mile, I felt exhausted, going on little food and sleep. I went in a store on the side of the highway to use their bathroom and try to steal some candy, and I saw some straggly-looking guys coming out with a case of beer. They were talking about day labor, and I realized I didn't have to walk all the way to San Antonio. New Braunfels had a day labor place just like San Antonio. I got some directions and walked to the day labor place in the middle of the night. They were closed, but there were a few riffraffs loitering out front. They were waiting for them to open, brazenly getting drunk. I'm interested in work, I said. Got any here? Yeah, you got ID and social security card, they asked? Yeah, I got that, I told them. Show it tomorrow and they let you work, they said. I went back to my van and found a ditty can of beans, pried it open, and ate it like Popeye. I was still hungry and searching for more food when I found an old foil pipe with a pinch of half-burnt weed still in it. After I got stoned, I realized my problems weren't as bad as I thought. I laughed, turned up my portable radio, and fell asleep to the oldies station. I walked back to the day labor place before sunrise, where they forced me to watch the local news with all the other penniless tramps. They finally offered me a job working on a roof of a local high school next to the freeway. It was in the sun with no shade for minimum wage. I worked on the roof, dripping with sweat and intermittently wiping my brow to stare down the freeway toward Austin, imagining what life would be like if I was rushing to class at Texas State or UT. When the boss man caught my wool gathering, he snarled me something fierce. By the end of the day, I made enough money for a belt for my van, and I convinced another day laborer to help me put it on. Within a few hours, I'd spent almost all of my day's wages when my van was running. I got back on the highway and headed towards San Antonio, but my mood turned sour the second I got back. I told myself I should have just stayed in Austin. Within a couple hours, I was depressed and sweating my ass off with nothing to do. I only saw the negative and needed some weed to calm my ass down and make me feel better. I didn't know where to buy less than a quarter pound, but Benny had told me about a pizza joint in a strip mall that sold 20 sacks. I only had $10 left from day labor, but I went there anyways, figuring I'd talk him into selling me a dime. The pizza place was owned by a young guy in his late 20s named Kenny. Kenny was from a middle-class family with loving parents. I met him a year earlier when Benny and I helped him put flyers for his then-yet-to-exist pizza place on his neighbor's doors. He made the flyers at the public library and baked the pizzas in his mom's kitchen. Kenny was a former Papa John's driver, inspired by the worker-to-owner story of the company's founder. He was a talkative pothead who loved the Beatles, Jesus, and NBA basketball. He came from a Jehovah's Witness background, but Kenny basically followed his own idea of Christianity. He didn't attend church, but he spoke about Jesus every chance he got. If he wasn't babbling about Christ, he'd be going on about how great the Beatles, the Spurs, or Hank Williams was. The worst thing about Kenny was his wife, Betty. She was a mess of a woman who spoke like she'd been raised in a Tijuana truck stop men's room. Kenny was passive and well-read, but Betty was loud and illiterate. They had a phony marriage that had something to do with how they got the startup money for the pizza parlor. They didn't even like each other. Their relationship, based on lies, was depressing. Betty would verbally emasculate Kenny in front of his friends and customers. She'd talk about things like him masturbating in a bubble bath and make everyone uncomfortable. Then she'd say something even more outrageous like, "Kenny likes to be spanked while wearing women's underwear," and the room would feel very awkward. The cops knew that they sold weed and would park right out across the street every afternoon. When I got there that day, Kenny didn't remember me, and I hadn't ever met Betty before, so they thought I was there to buy a pizza. This was supposed to be a place of business, so I didn't ask for the weed right away. I chewed the fat with Kenny while Kenny tossed pizza dough. Kenny did most of the talking in just about every conversation he ever had. Our conversation was no different. He excitedly told me how he was going to turn the dirtiest restaurant I'd ever seen into a top-of-the-line pizza parlor. I was surprised the health department even let them stay open. Their place was a dump. There was hardly any light, it smelled bad, and there weren't any bright signs, not even a cheap locally made canvas one or even one made from cardboard. "We want to keep a low profile," Betty would always say. Their counter was made of rotted wood they pulled from the dumpster. The place looked like it belonged in a third world country. The only thing they had that somewhat resembled a regular shop was the commercial oven he got from a strip club that was going out of business. I spent the next 4 hours in Kenny's fake restaurant. By the time it got dark, they offered me an under-the-table job delivering pizzas. He said I could help them put flyers on hotel rooms during the day at time hours when there weren't any pies to deliver, and Betty said I could help her sell weed while I delivered at night. I accepted their offer, and the three of us celebrated with cold beer, mushroom pizza, and a super fat joint. When it got late, I started to head out to the parking lot to sleep in my van, but Betty insisted I'd sleep inside, on the restaurant floor. At first I thought I'd be bunking by myself, but then I saw Betty grab their pillows, blankets, and sheets and realized they both slept here too. We each found a spot on the grungy floor and Betty hit the lights. 20 minutes later, we heard a slight tap on the door. Betty sighed like she'd been through this before, got up off the floor, and clicked the lights back on. It was the neighborhood bum, also named Kenny, who'd stolen money from my wallet when I was 16, the crackhead I'd spent a memorable night with by the railroad tracks years earlier. Kenny and Betty had been letting homeless Kenny sleep inside their pizza place. Before that, the guy was sleeping in the ditch across the street. Kenny and Betty were decent people and felt sorry for him. After they let the drug addict Kenny in their parlor, he acted like he didn't remember me and chatted away with the pizza place owner, Kenny, so I didn't bring up any old times. I was in too good of a mood. In a matter of hours, I'd scored some weed, a job, and a pizza place to live at. When we woke up the next morning, the homeless Kenny was gone, and everyone checked to make sure nothing was missing. I rolled a morning joint while Kenny whipped up a breakfast pie. The ambitious pizza place owner got me working right away. Before noon, we drove to a set of expensive hotels with a stack of flyers. Expensive hotels are a no-no for pizza flyer delivery. The security guards know all about flyer people, and if a tough one grabs you, there's a good chance he'll rough you up. I need someone they haven't seen before, Kenny said. Will I get in trouble? I asked. Not if you apologize, play dumb, and promise to leave, he told me. Why don't you do that? I already got my warning, he said. The flyers looked professional, and since the people staying in hotels were from out of town, they had no idea how ghetto Kenny's pizza place actually was. The larger pizza companies have an agreement with the hotel chains where they can put flyers inside the hotel rooms, but Kenny barely made enough dough to keep the lights on. I lived at their pizza place for about a month, dodging security guards in hallways while I put flyers on hotel doors during the day and avoiding cops on the road while I delivered pizzas and weed at night. Their pizza joint was right by Thousand Oaks Public Library, so I'd go there whenever I wanted to get away or do some reading. I made decent money, but it was all under the table and risky as hell. I didn't even have a driver's license, and most of the time I was driving like a nervous wreck trying to deliver someone a shitty pizza pie. I liked helping with their weed business, and it was fun running into the stoners I grew up with and hadn't seen in years. Kenny and Betty mainly sold weed, but occasionally she'd have me deliver sealed envelopes to shady figures during my late-night pizza runs. After a month, they finally found a set of apartments that take them, so I couldn't sleep on their pizza parlor floor anymore. I had to find somewhere to go at night, so I got a gig working the graveyard shift at a Kmart that was closing down. It was the same store Michael and I used to walk to as kids. The new Walmart had put them out of business, and they needed a bunch of temps to help them clear the shelves. Working at Kmart brought back memories, and I spent most of the early morning hours reminiscing about being a kid. I was 23 but felt older in some ways and younger in others. I thought about aging the whole shift. I'm sure not having enough sleep had something to do with it, but I'd spend an hour every night in the Kmart bathroom analyzing my skull, trying to see if my hairline was receding or my forehead was getting bigger. I felt like my chance of going to college and being a writer was fading. I didn't know much about college, but I knew most students were younger than I was. I imagined none of them had to work the graveyard shift at Kmart just to have somewhere to go at night. For a couple months, I delivered pizzas at Kenny's Pizza Place and worked at Kmart at night. Benny would sometimes come and visit me when I got off early in the morning, and a couple of times he snuck me into the apartment he was staying at near Churchill High School. On Easter morning that year, Benny picked me up when I got off of work at Kmart. We drove around smoking weed and blasting music until the sun came up, and then went back to his apartment. I didn't know his roommates, and it was basically their place, so he said I could stay for a little bit, but then I'd have to leave. I insisted he give me a ride back to my mom's house, or at least my van at the Kmart, but he was tired. We got in an argument, and I left and didn't see him for a while. I walked from Benny's apartment to Mom's backyard. About 10 miles. I cursed at all the cars driving by, the sky, and every blade of grass under my feet. When I came to an intersection, I saw a bum flying a sign and noticed an elderly woman about to hand him a $10 bill. I yelled out, "Don't give it to him," and ruined their moment. They both looked at me with disgust, and I regretted saying it the second it came out. When I had a day off, I'd go to the library and talk to the librarian. She told me it took a few months for the government to get back to somebody about financial aid in college. Be patient, she told me. This was in the internet's early days, and I hadn't ever even